Picture a glittering 1920s charity gala at St. Mary's Manor, where a priceless ruby necklace vanishes in a heartbeat, plunging the elite into a web of suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster from St. Mary Mead steps into the shadows of secrets, unraveling a tale of charm, deceit, and desperation. Was it the poised organizer, the charming gambler, the nervous jeweler, or the earnest volunteer? In a dance of clues, a cunning trap reveals the truth, a bold theft driven by debt, hidden in plain sight. Dive into a mystery where every glance hides a motive, and only Miss Marple sees the pattern. Chapter 1. The Charity Gala. The ballroom of St. Mary's Manor shimmered with the opulence of a bygone era, its crystal chandeliers casting prisms of light across polished oak floors. The Charity Gala, a grand affair orchestrated by Mrs. Clara Winthrop, filled the air with the murmur of cultured voices, the clink of champagne flutes, and the rustle of silk gowns. It was the event of the season in the quiet county of Danesshire, a beacon of philanthropy to benefit the St. Agnes Orphanage. Guests adorned in their finest moved with practiced grace, their laughter mingling with the strains of a string quartet tucked discreetly in an alcove. At the heart of the room, on a velvet-draped table, glowed the Hartley ruby necklace, its crimson gems catching the light like drops of fire, drawing admiring glances from every corner. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly near a gilded pillar, her small figure almost lost in the grandeur of the scene. Her black lace dress, modest yet elegant, and her silver hair neatly pinned beneath a simple hat, gave her the air of a kindly aunt, unremarkable to the untrained eye. Yet her gaze, sharp and bright as a sparrow's, missed nothing. She had been invited as a gesture of respect, her reputation for solving village mysteries having reached even the lofty circles of St. Mary's Manor. Mrs. Winthrop, ever gracious, had insisted, "Miss Marple, your presence would lend such charm to our evening." Miss Marple, with her usual humility, had accepted, though she suspected her true role was to observe, rather than to be observed. The necklace, loaned by Lady Beatrice Hartley for the auction, was the evening's centrepiece. Its gold filigree cradled rubies of extraordinary clarity, each stone said to carry a history of passion and loss. Lady Beatrice, a statuesque woman with an air of melancholic dignity, stood near the display, accepting compliments with a strained smile. Miss Marple noted her unease, the way her fingers twitched at her side as if reluctant to part with the heirloom. "A family treasure," Lady Beatrice had murmured to a guest, her voice soft but heavy with sentiment. Miss Marple, knitting a pale pink shawl in her lap, wondered if the necklace held more than monetary value. The crowd was a tapestry of Daneshires elite. Mrs. Winthrop, the organizer, glided through the room, her emerald gown catching the light as she ensured every detail was perfect. Her poise was flawless, yet Miss Marple detected a tightness in her smile, a hint of strain beneath her polished exterior. Nearby, Mr. Gerald Fairfax, a guest known for his charm and questionable finances, regaled a group with tales of his exploits abroad. His laughter was too loud, his gestures too expansive, and Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, recalling a young man in St. Mary Mead, whose charm had masked a penchant for deceit. Mr. Leonard Voss, the jeweller who had appraised the necklace, stood apart, his thin frame and wire-rimmed spectacles giving him a scholarly air. He hovered near the display, his fingers occasionally brushing the velvet case as if to reassure himself of its contents. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the way his eyes flicked to the crowd, assessing rather than admiring. She remembered a watchmaker in her village whose nervous tics had betrayed a guilty conscience. Lastly, Miss Emily Tate, a young volunteer with an earnest face and flushed cheeks, darted about, ensuring guests were welcomed and donations recorded. Her enthusiasm was infectious, but Miss Marple sensed a fragility in her, like a girl eager to prove herself in a world of wealth she did not belong to. The evening progressed, the quartet's music swelling as the auction hour approached. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically, her thoughts weaving through the faces around her. The necklace, she mused, was more than a prize. It was a magnet for envy, greed, or desperation. She recalled a theft in St. Mary Mead, a silver teapot vanished from a vicarage, and how the culprit's motives had been as clear as day once she'd looked past the obvious. Here, in this glittering room, the same human frailties lurked, dressed in finer clothes. As the clock struck 8, signalling the start of the auction, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the ruby necklace, its glow a silent challenge to her quiet intuition. Chapter 2. The Disappearance. The ballroom of St. Mary's Manor, moments before so vibrant with the hum of anticipation, froze into a tableau of shock. A piercing scream had shattered the delicate strains of the string quartet, and all eyes turned to Lady Beatrice Hartley, who stood near the velvet-draped table at the room's centre. Her hand clutched her throat, her face drained of colour, as if the very life had been siphoned from her. "The necklace!" she gasped, her voice a tremulous thread in the sudden silence. "It's gone!" The words hung in the air, sharp and accusing, as the crowd's collective gaze shifted to the display table. The velvet case, once cradling the Hartley ruby necklace, lay open, its silken lining gleaming mockingly under the chandelier's light, empty of its treasure. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the guests, swelling into a chorus of gasps and whispers. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her unobtrusive corner, set her knitting needles down with deliberate care. Her sharp eyes, undimmed by the years, scanned the room, noting the postures, the glances, the subtle shifts in expression that betrayed more than words ever could. She had seen such scenes before, in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, where a missing brooch or a pilfered purse could unravel a web of human weakness. Here, in the grandeur of the manor, the stakes were higher. But the instincts, she knew, were the same. The Hartley ruby necklace, with its cascade of crimson gems set in intricate gold, was no mere trinket. It was a fortune, a legacy, and she suspected, a catalyst for someone's desperation. Mrs. Clara Winthrop, the gala's impeccable organizer, stepped forward, her emerald gown catching the light as she raised her hands for calm. "Please, everyone, remain where you are," she said, her voice steady despite the faint tremor in her fingers. "There must be some mistake." Her eyes darted to the empty case, and for a moment Miss Marple caught a flicker of something, fear perhaps or calculation, beneath her composed exterior. Mrs. Winthrop was a widow of impeccable standing, known for her tireless work for the saint. Agnes Orphanage, but Miss Marple knew that even the most virtuous could harbour secrets. Had the necklace's disappearance threatened her carefully curated event, or was there more at play? The thought settled in Miss Marple's mind like a seed, waiting to take root. The crowd, however, was less restrained. A portly gentleman in a tailcoat muttered about negligence, while a young woman in a sapphire dress clutched her pearls, as if fearing they too might vanish. Mr. Gerald Fairfax, the charming guest with a reputation for gambling debts, stood near the table, his hands in his pockets, his smile curiously intact. "A bold thief," he remarked to no one in particular, his tone almost amused. Miss Marple's lips pursed. She had known men like Fairfax in her village, men whose easy charm cloaked a knack for opportunism. His proximity to the display during the evening was no coincidence, she thought. Recalling how he had lingered near Lady Beatrice, his anecdotes drawing her attention from the necklace. Mr. Leonard Voss, the jeweller who had certified the necklace's authenticity, hovered at the edge of the table, his thin face pale behind his wire-rimmed spectacles. He adjusted his glasses repeatedly, a nervous tic that Miss Marple noted with interest. "This is unthinkable," he said, his voice low but sharp. "I examined it myself this morning." It was flawless. His words were meant to reassure, but there was a brittleness to them, as if he feared scrutiny. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to a saint. Mary Mead craftsman, who had once swapped a silver locket for a counterfeit, his expertise making the deception seamless. Voss, with his intimate knowledge of gems, had both the skill and the opportunity to orchestrate something similar. She made a mental note of his unease, her fingers itching to resume her knitting, though her attention remained fixed on the scene. Miss Emily Tate, the young volunteer, stood frozen near the display, her hands clasped tightly before her. Her plain dress and earnest demeanour set her apart from the glittering guests, but her eyes were wide with panic. "I was right here," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "I only looked away for a moment." Her voice broke, and tears glistened in her eyes. Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy, but tempered it with caution. Innocence could be genuine or crafted, and Emily's distress, while compelling, did not absolve her. In St. Mary Mead, a young maid had once wept over a stolen candlestick, only to be found hiding it in her attic. Emily's role as a volunteer gave her access to the display, and her brief absence, she claimed, coincided with the theft. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind remained alert. Mrs. Winthrop, regaining her composure, signalled to the manor's staff to secure the doors. "No one leaves until we've searched," she declared, her tone brooking no argument. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, some indignant, others curious. Lady Beatrice, still trembling, sank into a chair, a handkerchief pressed to her lips. "It was my husband's gift," she murmured to a sympathetic matron. "The last thing he gave me before he passed." Her words carried a weight that silenced those nearby, and Miss Marple noted the genuine grief in her voice. The necklace's sentimental value, she realized, might complicate motives. Was it stolen for profit, or was there a deeper, more personal reason? The constable, Mr. Harrow, a sturdy man with a no-nonsense air, arrived promptly, summoned by a discreet telephone call from Mrs. Winthrop. His presence brought a semblance of order, though his broad face betrayed his unease at handling a theft among such high society. "We'll need statements," he said, his notebook already in hand, "and a thorough search of the premises." He glanced at the empty case, his brow furrowing. Whoever took it didn't have much time. "It was there at 8, wasn't it, Mrs. Winthrop?" She nodded, her lips tight. "I checked it myself," she said. "It was secure." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Mrs. Winthrop's certainty was admirable, but the timing was critical. The auction had been set for 8:30, and the scream had come shortly after 8:15. A narrow window, she thought, but enough for a practised hand. The guests were ushered into the adjoining drawing room, where the atmosphere grew tense. Whispers of suspicion darted like minnows, with fingers pointed at staff, at strangers, even at one another. Miss Marple, declining to join the throng, remained near the ballroom's edge, her chair offering a clear view of the display table and the side door beyond it. She had noticed the door earlier, half hidden by a heavy curtain leading to a service passage. It was an unassuming exit, easily overlooked in the gala's bustle, but it offered a discreet route to the manor's courtyard. She made a mental note to inquire about its lock, suspecting it might hold a clue. As the constable began his inquiries, Miss Marple observed the 4 figures closest to the theft. Mrs. Winthrop, now conferring with Mr. Harrow, seemed determined to salvage the evening, but her hands betrayed her nerves they were twisting a lace handkerchief into knots. Fairfax, lounging against a pillar, chatted with a young heiress, his nonchalance almost defiant. Voss, standing alone, polished his glasses yet again, his eyes darting to the empty case as if it accused him personally. Emily, meanwhile, hovered near the staff, her face a mask of guilt and fear, as if she blamed herself for the lapse. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to motive. Greed was the obvious culprit, but envy, resentment, or even necessity could drive such an act. She recalled a theft in her village, where a desperate farmer had taken a neighbour's savings, not for wealth, but to save his land. Human nature, she knew, was rarely simple. The search began, with footmen and maids inspecting the ballroom under Mr. Harrow's direction. Guests submitted reluctantly to pat-downs, their indignation tempered by the gravity of the loss. Miss Marple watched closely, noting how Fairfax's smile never wavered, even as a footman checked his pockets. Voss, by contrast, flinched at the approach of a maid, his hands hovering protectively over his coat. Emily submitted to the search with a quiet dignity, her eyes downcast, while Mrs. Winthrop oversaw the process with an air of command, though her gaze flickered to the side door more than once. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. The door, she thought, was a thread worth pulling. As the search yielded nothing, the guests grew restless, their murmurs turning to complaints. "This is outrageous," declared a ruddy-faced colonel, his moustache quivering. "Are we all suspects now?" Mr. Harrow, undeterred, moved to question those nearest the display. Mrs. Winthrop repeated her account, insisting she had seen the necklace at 8, when she adjusted the velvet case for better lighting. Fairfax claimed to have been charming Lady Beatrice, a fact she confirmed, though her recollection was vague, clouded by her distress. Voss admitted to inspecting the necklace earlier, but swore he had been with a client, a local squire, during the critical moments. The squire, however, was deep in his cups, his memory unreliable. Emily, trembling, recounted her duties, admitting she had stepped away to fetch a tray of glasses at Fairfax's request, leaving the table briefly unguarded. Her confession drew sharp looks, but Miss Marple saw no guile in her, only a young woman overwhelmed by responsibility. The constable's questions grew repetitive, and Miss Marple's attention wandered to the room's details. The display table, she noted, was positioned near a window draped in heavy brocade, its folds offering potential concealment. The side door, just beyond, led to a passage used by staff, its lock reportedly faulty, according to a maid Miss Marple had overheard earlier. She imagined a swift hand slipping the necklace into a pocket or a hidden bag, then vanishing through the passage to the courtyard. The thief would need nerve, she thought, and a knowledge of the manor's layout. Her mind circled back to Voss, whose shop was a mere street away, easily reached via the courtyard. A jeweller skilled in handling gems could manage such a feat, but so could an organizer with access to every corner of the manor, or a guest with a gambler's daring, or even a volunteer with a moment's opportunity. Lady Beatrice, now sipping a restorative brandy, spoke softly to Miss Marple, who had approached under the guise of offering comfort. "It's not just the value," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It was Edward's last gift. He chose each ruby himself." Her eyes glistened, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind noting the detail. Sentimental value could inspire theft as much as greed, she knew, recalling a saint, Mary Mead widow, who had stolen a rival's keepsake out of spite. But Lady Beatrice's grief seemed genuine, and Miss Marple filed the information away, her thoughts already weaving a pattern from the evening's chaos. As the search wound down, Mr. Harrow announced that the manor would remain under watch, and guests were free to leave, though none did so immediately, lingering in hopes of news. Miss Marple, however, felt no such urgency. She resumed her knitting, the soft click of her needles a counterpoint to the room's tension. The necklace's absence was a puzzle, and she relished its complexity. Each suspect, Mrs. Winthrop, Fairfax, Voss, Emily, had a role in the evening's drama, their actions and alibis forming a tapestry of possibilities. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that the truth often hid in the smallest details. A glance, a gesture, a misplaced word. Here, in the glittering aftermath of the gala, she sensed the same truth waiting to be unravelled, its threads already tangling in her quiet, observant mind. Chapter 3. The Organizer's Burden. The drawing-room of St. Mary's Manor, where the guests had been shepherded after the necklace's disappearance, was a study in restrained opulence. Its walls, adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, seemed to frown upon the assembled company, their eyes following the restless movements of the crowd. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax polish, and the faint tang of spilled champagne, a reminder of the gala's abrupt end. Miss Jane Marple sat near a rosewood table, her knitting needles clicking softly, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. Yet her eyes, bright and unyielding, missed nothing. The way a lady's fan fluttered too quickly, or how a gentleman's hand strayed to his watch, betraying impatience or unease. Theft of the Hartley ruby necklace had cast a pall over the evening, and suspicion, like a chill draught, crept into every glance. Mrs. Clara Winthrop, the gala's organizer, stood at the room's centre, her emerald gown now seeming more like armour than adornment. She was a woman of 50, her auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon, her bearing that of one accustomed to command. Yet, as she addressed the guests urging patience while the constable continued his inquiries, Miss Marple noted a strain in her voice, a tightness that belied her outward calm. "We shall resolve this," Mrs. Winthrop said, her hands clasped before her, fingers twisting slightly. "The necklace cannot have gone far." Her words were firm, but her eyes darted to the ballroom door, as if expecting the thief to emerge with a confession. Miss Marple, whose village had taught her to read the unspoken, sensed that Mrs. Winthrop carried a burden heavier than the evening's failure. The constable, Mr. Harrow, had moved his questioning to the drawing-room, his notebook a shield against the indignation of the elite. He was a man of method, if not imagination, and his questions to Mrs. Winthrop were precise. "You checked the necklace at 8, you say?" he asked, his pencil poised. Mrs. Winthrop nodded, her chin lifting slightly. "Yes, I adjusted the case to catch the light better for the auction." It was there, gleaming as always. Her voice held a note of defiance, as if daring anyone to question her diligence. Miss Marple's needles paused. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a shopkeeper who swore to his inventory safety, only to be found hiding stolen goods in his cellar. Mrs. Winthrop's certainty was convincing, but certainty, Miss Marple knew, could be a mask. She invited Miss Marple to tea the following morning, a gesture framed as courtesy, but tinged with urgency. Miss Marple accepted with her usual mildness, sensing an opportunity to probe deeper. The meeting took place in the Manor's morning room, a sunny space with chintz curtains and a view of the rose garden. Mrs. Winthrop, dressed in a simple but elegant grey dress, poured tea with a steady hand, though her eyes betrayed her sleepless night. "I cannot fathom it, Miss Marple," she said, setting the teapot down with a faint clink. "The necklace was my responsibility. Its loss is a stain on my reputation." Her voice wavered, and she looked away, her gaze settling on a vase of lilies as if they held answers. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of gentle sympathy. "These events are trying, Mrs. Winthrop," she said, "but tell me, how did you come to organize such a splendid gala?" The question was innocent, but it opened a door. Mrs. Winthrop spoke of her years of charity work, her devotion to the orphanage, and the pressure to make the event a success. "Lady Beatrice trusted me with the necklace," she said, her fingers tightening on her cup. "I checked it thrice, that day, morning, afternoon, and at 8. I even ensured the table was never left unattended." Her emphasis on her diligence was almost too insistent, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to a saint, Mary Mead widow, who had overemphasized her honesty to conceal a small theft. As they spoke, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the Manor's staff. Mrs. Winthrop admitted to a lapse. The side door near the display table had been left unlocked, a mistake she attributed to a new footman. "I should have checked it myself," she said, her voice low, "but with so many details, guests, catering, the auction, I relied on others." Her admission was candid, but Miss Marple noted a fleeting glance toward the window, as if she feared being overheard. The side door, Miss Marple mused, was a critical detail, one that suggested an inside knowledge of the Manor's workings. Mrs. Winthrop, as organizer, knew every inch of the house, every routine of the staff. Could she have orchestrated the theft to cover some personal failing, perhaps a debt or a scandal? The thought was speculative, but Miss Marple filed it away, her mind as orderly as her knitting basket. Mrs. Winthrop's demeanour softened as she spoke of the orphanage, her passion genuine. "Those children depend on us," she said, her eyes bright with conviction. "The auction was to fund a new dormitory." Yet, as she spoke, Miss Marple noticed a hesitation, a slight pause when mentioning the necklace's insurance. Lady Beatrice insisted it was covered, Mrs. Winthrop said quickly, as if to dismiss the topic. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Insurance could tempt a desperate soul, she knew, recalling a village merchant who had staged a burglary to claim a payout. Mrs. Winthrop's wealth was rumoured to be dwindling, her late husband's estate less robust than it appeared. Could the necklace's loss serve a dual purpose? Financial gain and a preserved reputation? The conversation turned to the other suspects, and Mrs. Winthrop's opinions were revealing. She spoke warmly of Emily Tate, praising her dedication but noting her inexperience. "She's young, easily flustered," she said, a touch of pity in her voice. Of Mr. Fairfax, her tone cooled. "A charming man, but unreliable. He's known to owe money about town." Her words were measured, but Miss Marple caught a hint of disdain, as if Fairfax's presence at the gala had been a necessary evil, perhaps to appease a wealthy patron. Of Mr. Voss, she was more reserved. A skilled jeweller, but reserved. He kept to himself, though he was most particular about the necklace's display. Her comment was neutral, but Miss Marple noted the careful choice of words, as if Mrs. Winthrop feared saying too much. As they finished their tea, Miss Marple rose, thanking her hostess with her usual courtesy. "You've done a great service for the orphanage," she said, her tone warm but her eyes keen. "I'm sure the truth will come." To light, Mrs. Winthrop smiled, but it was a strained smile, and as Miss Marple left the morning room, she felt the weight of unspoken truths. The organizer's burden, she thought, was not just the theft, but something deeper, perhaps a fear of exposure, or a misstep she could not afford to admit. Walking through the manor's gardens, Miss Marple paused by the courtyard, her eyes tracing the path from the side door. It was a secluded spot, screened by yew hedges, where a thief could slip away unnoticed. She recalled Mrs. Winthrop's mention of the footman's error, and resolved to speak with the staff later. Her thoughts returned to the organizer's demeanour. The insistence on her vigilance, the fleeting glances, the quick dismissal of the insurance question. In St. Mary Mead, such signs often pointed to a truth hidden in plain sight. Mrs. Winthrop's role gave her unparalleled access, but also unparalleled responsibility. If she were involved, her motive would be subtle, woven into the fabric of her public persona. Miss Marple's knitting resumed as she sat on a garden bench, the soft click of her needles a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. The necklace's disappearance was a puzzle, and Mrs. Winthrop was a piece that did not yet fit. Was she a victim of circumstance, or had she, in her meticulous planning, left a door unlocked, literally or figuratively, for a purpose? The answer, Miss Marple knew, lay in the small details, the ones others overlooked. As the sun dipped behind the manor's turrets, she felt the familiar thrill of a mystery unfolding, its threads waiting to be gathered by her quiet, relentless mind. Chapter 4. The Charming Guest. The morning after the gala, St. Mary's Manor seemed to hold its breath, the grandeur of its halls muted by the lingering shock of the Hartley ruby necklace's theft. The drawing-room, now bathed in the soft light of a cloudy day, was less crowded but no less tense, with small clusters of guests and staff whispering their theories. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a plush velvet chair near a bay window, appeared absorbed in her knitting, the pale pink shawl growing steadily under her deft fingers. Yet her eyes, bright and unobtrusive, followed the movements of Mr. Gerald Fairfax, who lounged against a marble fireplace, his easy smile as polished as the room's furnishings. He was the picture of nonchalance, his dark suit impeccably tailored, his hair artfully tousled, but Miss Marple knew that such charm often cloaked a less savoury truth. Fairfax was a man of 35, with the kind of face that drew admiring glances, high cheekbones, a roguish grin, and eyes that sparkled with mischief. He had spent the gala weaving through the crowd, his anecdotes of foreign adventures and narrow escapes delighting the guests, particularly Lady Beatrice Hartley. Now, as he chatted with a young heiress, his laughter rang out, too bright for the sombre mood. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically, her thoughts drifting to a saint. Mary Mead gentleman, a certain Mr. Carver, whose charm had masked a penchant for borrowing money he never repaid. Fairfax, she suspected, was cut from similar cloth, his presence at the gala likely tied to his need for wealthy connections rather than philanthropy. The constable, Mr. Harrow, had resumed his inquiries, his broad frame moving methodically among the remaining guests. Fairfax, when called, sauntered over with a casual air, as if the theft were a minor inconvenience. "I was with Lady Beatrice most of the evening," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. "We were discussing my time in Monte Carlo. Quite a story, that one." He flashed a grin, but Mr. Harrow's expression remained stern. "Can anyone confirm your whereabouts between 8 and 8:15? The constable asked, his pencil hovering over his notebook. Fairfax shrugged, his smile unwavering. "I'm sure someone saw me." The room was packed, wasn't it? His vagueness was deliberate, Miss Marple noted, recalling how Mr. Carver had dodged questions with the same breezy confidence. Lady Beatrice, still shaken, was less certain. Seated nearby, her hands clasped tightly around a shawl, she confirmed Fairfax's company, but admitted her attention had wandered. "He was telling me about a card game in Venice," she said, her voice faint. "But I was distracted, watching the necklace. I can't say exactly when he was beside me." Her uncertainty left a gap in Fairfax's alibi, and Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. A man like Fairfax, she thought, thrived on such gaps, using charm to blur the edges of suspicion. She recalled a village dance where a young man's flirtations had distracted a shopkeeper while his friend pilfered the till. Could Fairfax have played a similar role, diverting attention from the display table? Miss Marple decided to observe him more closely, accepting an invitation to join a small group for luncheon in the Manor's dining room. The table was set with crisp linens and silver, but the mood was subdued, the theft casting a shadow over the meal. Fairfax, seated across from her, was in his element, regaling the group with a tale of a Moroccan bazaar where he'd haggled for a sapphire ring. "Nearly lost my shirt," he said, chuckling, "but I walked away with a gem." His eyes twinkled, but Miss Marple noted how they flicked to the door, as if he expected an interruption or an escape. She sipped her soup, her demeanour one of polite interest, but her mind was cataloguing his every gesture. During a lull in the conversation, she ventured a gentle question. "Mr. Sid Fairfax, you must have an eye for fine things, having seen so much of the world. Did you admire the Hartley necklace?" Her tone was mild, almost admiring, but her eyes were keen. Fairfax leaned back, his smile broadening. "Oh, it was a stunner, Miss Marple. Those rubies, positively alive in the light. I told Lady Beatrice it deserved a queen. His flattery was effortless, but Miss Marple caught a slight tightening of his jaw, as if her question had brushed a nerve. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Gambler, whose boasts about wealth hid a mountain of debts. Fairfax's lifestyle, rumoured to be funded by loans and lucky bets, suggested a man who might see a ruby necklace as a solution to pressing troubles. The luncheon conversation turned to the theft, and Fairfax was quick to offer his theory. "Likely a professional," he said, swirling his wine. "Someone slipped in, nabbed it, and was out that side door before anyone noticed." His tone was casual, but Miss Marple noted his mention of the side door, which Mrs. Winthrop had only yesterday revealed as unlocked. Had Fairfax observed it during the gala, or did he know more than he let on? She made a mental note to check his movements further, perhaps through the staff, who often saw what guests did not. After luncheon, Miss Marple strolled the manor's grounds, her shawl draped over her shoulders against the autumn chill. She paused near the courtyard, where the side door's path emerged, and considered Fairfax's alibi. His charm had kept Lady Beatrice occupied, but his claim of constant presence was shaky, resting on fleeting glimpses from other guests, none of whom could pinpoint his location during the critical minutes. She recalled Emily Tate's admission that Fairfax had asked her to fetch a drink, leaving the display table briefly unguarded. The timing was convenient, Miss Marple thought, picturing Fairfax's easy smile as he manoeuvred the young volunteer away. In St. Mary Mead, a similar distraction had allowed a thief to pocket a silver spoon during a tea party. Seeking more insight, Miss Marple approached a footman, a young man named Thomas, who had served drinks at the gala. Under her gentle questioning, disguised as idle chat, he recalled Fairfax's presence near the display table. "He was always moving about, ma'am," Thomas said, polishing a tray. "Talking, laughing, never still." "I saw him near the table just before 8, asking Miss Emily for a glass of sherry." His tone was neutral, but Miss Marple sensed a hint of disapproval, as if Fairfax's familiarity with the staff had been too bold. She thanked Thomas, her mind turning over the detail. Fairfax's request had given him a moment alone with the necklace, or at least near it. A practiced hand could have acted swiftly, she thought, especially one accustomed to taking risks. Returning to the drawing-room, Miss Marple observed Fairfax once more, now engaged in a game of cards with a group of younger guests. His laughter was infectious, his gestures expansive, but she noted how his eyes occasionally scanned the room, as if gauging who watched him. His confidence was his shield, but it was also his weakness, she mused, recalling how Mr. Carver's bravado had unravelled when confronted with a single pointed question. Fairfax's debts, rumoured to be substantial, gave him motive, and his charm gave him opportunity. Yet, she cautioned herself, charm alone did not make a thief. The necklace's weight and size required a hiding place, and Fairfax's slim-fitting suit offered little concealment. Had he passed it to an accomplice, or was his role merely to distract? As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting a quiet rhythm in the fading light. Fairfax's alibi was porous, his demeanour too polished, his knowledge of the side door too convenient. Yet she sensed he was not the mastermind, but perhaps a player in a larger scheme. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that charm often served as a distraction for darker deeds. Fairfax, with his gambler's nerve and debtor's desperation, was a thread in the tapestry of the theft, but not the whole pattern. Her needles clicked on, each stitch a step closer to the truth, as she turned her thoughts to the next piece of the puzzle, knowing the manor held more secrets yet to be unravelled. Chapter 5. The Jeweller's Expertise. The pale light of an overcast afternoon filtered through the tall windows of St. Mary's Manor, casting long shadows across the polished floors of the library, where Miss Jane Marple had settled with her knitting. The room, lined with leather-bound volumes and smelling faintly of old paper and wax, offered a quiet retreat from the murmur of suspicion that still lingered in the manor's public spaces. Her needles moved with their usual precision, the pale pink shawl growing steadily, but her attention was fixed on Mr. Leonard Voss, the jeweller who had appraised the Hartley ruby necklace before its disappearance. He stood near a bookcase, ostensibly browsing titles, but his restless fingers betrayed him, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles with a frequency that Miss Marple found telling. She had known men like Voss in St. Mary Mead, men whose expertise made them indispensable, yet whose nerves could betray a hidden truth. Voss was a slight man, nearing 60, with a scholar's stoop and a face etched with lines of concentration. His reputation as Danger's finest jeweller was unassailable, his shop a haven for the county's elite seeking bespoke pieces. At the gala, he had been a quiet presence, his role limited to certifying the necklace's authenticity and ensuring its display was flawless. Yet, Miss Marple had noted his proximity to the velvet case, his hands hovering as if drawn to the ruby's glow. Now, as he turned a page without reading it, she sensed a man under strain, his composure a fragile veneer. In her village, a clockmaker with a similar air of precision had once crafted a false compartment in a heirloom, fooling all but her keen eye. Could Voss, with his intimate knowledge of gems, have engineered a theft so audacious? Miss Marple's opportunity to observe him came at a small gathering in the manor's conservatory, where Mrs. Winthrop had arranged tea for those still lingering after the theft. The conservatory, with its glass walls and profusion of ferns, was a humid oasis, the air heavy with the scent of earth and blooms. Voss sat at a wrought-iron table, his teacup untouched, his gaze fixed on a distant orchid as if it held the answers to his unease. Miss Marple, seated opposite, offered a gentle smile. "You must have seen many fine jewels, Mr. Voss," she said, her voice soft as a breeze. "Was the Hartley necklace as remarkable as they say?" Her question was innocent, but her eyes were sharp, watching for the flicker of a tell. Voss started slightly, his glasses slipping down his nose. "Oh, quite remarkable," he said, his voice precise but clipped. "The rubies were Burmese, of exceptional clarity. The setting, gold filigree from the last century, was exquisite." He spoke with the authority of his craft, but his fingers resumed their dance with his spectacles, polishing the lenses with a handkerchief. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "Such skill to recognize quality," she said. "It must take years to master." Voss's lips twitched into a faint smile, but his eyes darted to the side, avoiding hers. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead silversmith, whose nervous gestures had betrayed his role in a forgery. Voss's expertise, she thought, could serve a darker purpose. A replica necklace, perhaps, crafted to deceive. The conversation turned to the gala, and Voss offered his account with practised ease. "I inspected the necklace at 10 that morning," he said. "It was perfect, not a flaw." I was near the display later, ensuring the lighting showed it to advantage, but I was with Mr. Pembroke, the squire, during the theft. His alibi, Miss Marple noted, rested on the squire, whose drunken state at the gala made his testimony unreliable. She probed gently, asking about the case's security. "It was sturdy," Voss said, his voice tightening. "A simple lock, but sufficient. I assumed Mrs. Winthrop's staff would guard it." His words carried a hint of blame, and Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Deflection, she knew, was often a sign of guilt, as she had seen in a village carpenter who blamed others for his own shoddy work. As the tea ended, Miss Marple resolved to visit Voss's shop, a short walk from the manor, under the guise of seeking a brooch. The shop was a narrow, elegant space, its windows lined with velvet displays of sparkling gems. Voss greeted her with a professional smile, but his eyes were wary, and she noted a faint tremor in his hands as he showed her a selection of pins. "Something simple, perhaps," he suggested, his voice overly bright. Miss Marple admired a sapphire brooch, her chatter light but calculated. "You must handle such treasures daily," she said. "Ever tempted to keep one for yourself?" The question was playful, but Voss's reaction was telling. A sharp intake of breath, a quick glance at his workbench. "Never," he said too quickly. "My work is my pride." Miss Marple smiled, but her gaze lingered on the workbench, where a small tool gleamed beside a fragment of red stone, its hue strikingly similar to the Hartley rubies. She recalled a case in Sonnet, Mary Mead, where a jeweller's apprentice had swapped a diamond for glass, his skill making the deception nearly perfect. Voss, with his years of experience, could craft a replica necklace, replacing the original with a fake, so convincing that only an expert would notice. The fragment on his workbench was a clue, she thought, though not proof. She thanked him and left, her mind turning over the possibilities. Voss's nerves, his access to the necklace, and his solitary habits made him a compelling suspect, but she cautioned herself against haste. In her village, she had learned that the most obvious culprit was not always the true one. Back at the manor, Miss Marple sought out the constable, Mr. Harrow, who was reviewing statements in the library. She mentioned Voss's behaviour in passing, her tone casual. "He seems so particular about his work," she said, "almost too particular, don't you think?" Mr. Harrow, his brow furrowed, noted it, but seemed more focused on the staff's lapses. Miss Marple did not press, knowing her role was to observe, not to direct. She returned to her knitting, her thoughts circling Voss's expertise. A jeweller could dismantle a necklace, she mused, selling the rubies individually to avoid suspicion. The side door, so conveniently unlocked, was near his shop, a quick escape, a hidden stash. Yet, she wondered, would a man of Voss's pride risk his reputation? Or was there a deeper motive, perhaps a debt or a grudge? As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by the library's fire, the manor quiet save for the distant clatter of staff preparing dinner. Voss's nervous tics, his evasive glances, and that ruby fragment haunted her thoughts. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead incident where a craftsman's pride had masked desperation, his skill turned to deceit to save his failing business. Voss, she suspected, was under similar pressure, his shop perhaps less prosperous than it appeared. The necklace's theft was a bold act, requiring precision and nerve, qualities Voss possessed in abundance. Yet, she reminded herself, the puzzle was incomplete. Fairfax's charm, Mrs. Winthrop's strain, and Emily's distress were threads yet to be woven together. Her needles clicked on, each stitch a quiet promise to unravel the truth, as the manor's secrets whispered in the shadows. Chapter 6. The volunteer's zeal. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of St. Mary's Manor, casting a soft glow over the morning room where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm. The manor had settled into an uneasy calm, the bustle of the gala replaced by a quiet tension, as the investigation into the Hartley ruby necklace's theft continued. Miss Marple's pale pink shawl grew steadily in her lap, but her attention was fixed on Miss Emily Tate, the young volunteer whose earnest demeanour and flushed cheeks had marked her as a figure of interest. Emily, now tidying a tray of tea things in the corner, moved with a nervous energy, her hands trembling slightly as she stacked cups. Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing beyond the surface, sensed that Emily's zeal, while genuine, might conceal a vulnerability or a secret. Emily was barely 20, with a plain but pleasant face framed by dark curls, her simple grey dress a stark contrast to the gala's opulence. Her role as a volunteer had been to assist Mrs. Winthrop, guiding guests, managing donations, and keeping watch over the display table where the necklace had rested. Her distress at its loss had been palpable, her tearful admission to stepping away from the table, drawing sharp looks from the guests. Yet Miss Marple, who had seen many a young woman in St. Mary Mead weep under pressure, knew that tears could mask more than they revealed. Emily's sincerity was compelling, but sincerity, she mused, could be as much a tool as guile. Miss Marple found her opportunity to speak with Emily in the manor's garden, where the girl had been sent to gather flowers for the dining room. The rose garden was a tranquil space, its paths lined with late-blooming blooms, their scent mingling with the crisp autumn air. Emily knelt by a bed of roses, her fingers careful as she clipped stems, but her eyes were red-rimmed, her lips pressed into a tight line. Miss Marple approached with her usual gentle air, her shawl draped over her shoulders. "Such lovely roses, Miss Tate," she said, pausing to admire a crimson bloom. "You have a deft hand with them." Her tone was warm, inviting confidence, and Emily glanced up, her expression softening. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she said, her voice small. "I try to be useful." The words carried a weight, as if usefulness were her shield against the world's judgment. Miss Marple settled on a nearby bench, her knitting resuming as she invited Emily to sit. "It must be overwhelming, helping with such a grand event," she said. "All those important people, and you so young." Her words were kind, but her eyes were keen, watching for the girl's reaction. Emily's cheeks flushed, and she twisted a rose stem in her hands. "I wanted to do well," she said. "Mrs. Winthrop trusted me, and I let her down." The confession came haltingly, and Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking softly. Emily recounted her duties at the gala, welcoming guests, ensuring the donation ledger was accurate, and keeping an eye on the display table. "I was there most of the evening," she said, her voice trembling. "But Mr. Fairfax asked me to fetch a drink, and I thought it would only be a moment." Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, her hands clenching the rose stem until a thorn pricked her finger. Miss Marple offered her handkerchief, her gesture one of quiet compassion, but her mind was alert. In St. Mary Mead, a young maid had once been persuaded to leave her post, allowing a theft to occur. Emily's absence, however brief, had created the window for the necklace's disappearance. "How long were you gone, my dear?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as gentle as a breeze. Emily hesitated, her brow furrowing. "Not more than 2 minutes," she said. "I went to the refreshment table, just across the ballroom. But when I returned, the necklace was still there. Or so I thought." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in the handkerchief. Miss Marple patted her arm, her thoughts turning to the timeline. The theft had occurred between 8 and 8:15, a narrow window that Emily's absence neatly fit. Yet her distress seemed genuine, and Miss Marple recalled a saint. Mary Mead girl whose tears had been real, though her actions had been misguided. Could Emily have been an unwitting accomplice, distracted by Fairfax's charm? Probing further, Miss Marple asked about the necklace itself. "It must have been a sight," she said, her eyes soft but searching. Emily nodded, a flicker of awe crossing her face. "It was beautiful," she said, "like fire, the way it caught the light. I couldn't stop looking at it." Her words held a hint of longing, and Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Envy, she knew, could drive even the most innocent to rash acts. In her village, a young seamstress had once pocketed a ribbon, not for gain but because its beauty haunted her. Emily's modest background, her father a clerk, her mother a seamstress, suggested a life far removed from such opulence. Had the necklace's allure tempted her, or was her admiration merely that of a girl unused to such splendour? Miss Marple steered the conversation to the other suspects, her questions light but deliberate. Emily spoke warmly of Mrs. Winthrop, calling her kind but strict. "She wanted everything perfect," Emily said. "I tried so hard to please her." Of Fairfax, her tone was cautious. "He was nice, but too friendly, maybe. He kept talking to everyone, even me." Her cheeks flushed again, and Miss Marple noted the hint of discomfort. Fairfax's request for a drink, she thought, was no accident. It had drawn Emily away at a critical moment. Of Mr. Voss, Emily said little, describing him as quiet and serious. "He fussed over the necklace," she said, "always checking it like it was his own." Her observation was innocent, but Miss Marple filed it away, recalling Voss's nervous tics and the ruby fragment in his shop. As they parted, Emily clutching her bouquet of roses, Miss Marple watched her go, her thoughts weaving a pattern. Emily's zeal was her strength, but also her weakness, making her vulnerable to manipulation. Fairfax's charm, Voss's expertise, and Mrs. Winthrop's oversight all circled the girl's brief absence, a moment that had allowed the theft. Miss Marple returned to the manor, pausing by the side door near the display table. It stood ajar, its lock still faulty, as a maid had confirmed. The door led to the courtyard, a shadowed path where a thief could slip away. Emily, with her access and her distraction, was a piece of the puzzle, but Miss Marple sensed she was not the key. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that the innocent were often pawns in a larger game. Sitting by the library fire that evening, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the manor's quiet hum a backdrop to her thoughts. Emily's tears, her earnestness, her fleeting absence, they pointed to a role, but not a leading one. Someone had used her, she suspected, exploiting her eagerness to please. The necklace's theft required planning. and Emily's simplicity suggested she was a tool, not the craftsman. Her needles clicked on, each stitch a step toward clarity, as Miss Marple turned her mind to the manor's other secrets, knowing the truth lay just beyond the next thread. Chapter 7. The Manor's Secrets. The evening shadows lengthened across the grounds of St. Mary's Manor, their edges softening the stark lines of the stone facade as Miss Jane Marple walked slowly along a gravel path. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and fading roses, and her shawl was drawn tightly about her shoulders. Her knitting, for once, remained in its basket, her hands free to clasp the handle of her sturdy umbrella, which served more as a walking stick than a shield against rain. The manor, with its towering gables and ivy-clad walls, seemed to watch her in return, its windows glinting like eyes holding secrets. Miss Marple's sharp gaze, undimmed by the gathering dusk, was fixed on the puzzle of the Hartley ruby necklace's theft, and she sensed that the manor itself held clues, if only she could read its silent language. The events of the gala replayed in her mind, each detail a thread in the tapestry of the crime. The empty velvet case, the unlocked side door, the fleeting absences of suspects, all pointed to a theft that relied on intimate knowledge of the manor's workings. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had solved a mystery of a stolen brooch by noting a window left ajar, a detail overlooked by all but her. Here, the side door near the display table, leading to a service passage and the courtyard beyond, was a similar oversight, one that Mrs. Winthrop had attributed to a careless footman. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced that carelessness alone explained it. The manor, she mused, was a stage, and its passages and doors were the wings where the drama's true actors moved unseen. She began her exploration at the ballroom, now quiet save for the soft tread of a maid sweeping the floor. The display table, stripped of its velvet, stood forlornly near the heavy brocade curtains that framed the side door. Miss Marple approached, her umbrella tapping lightly on the polished oak. The door was unassuming, its brass handle worn from years of use by staff. She pushed it open, noting its smooth swing and the absence of a creak, a well-maintained exit, despite the reported faulty lock. The passage beyond was narrow, its walls lined with faded wallpaper, and it led to a small vestibule opening onto the courtyard. Miss Marple stepped into the cool evening air, her eyes tracing the cobblestone path that wound through yew hedges to a gate, barely visible in the twilight. The courtyard was secluded, screened from the main gardens by dense foliage, and Miss Marple pictured a thief slipping through, the necklace concealed in a pocket or a bag. The gate led to a quiet lane, a mere stone's throw from Mr. Voss's jewellery shop. The proximity was striking, and she recalled the ruby fragment on his workbench, its hue a silent accusation. Yet she cautioned herself, proximity alone was not proof. Mrs. Winthrop, with her command of the manor's staff, could have ensured the door's lock was overlooked. Mr. Fairfax, with his gambler's daring, might have used the passage for a swift escape. Even Emily Tate, in her earnest distraction, could have unwittingly aided a plan. The manor's layout, Miss Marple realized, was a conspirator in the theft, its secrets as vital as those of the suspects. Seeking more insight, she returned to the manor and sought out the housekeeper, Mrs. Dodd, a stout woman with a no-nonsense air and a wealth of knowledge about the house. Miss Marple found her in the servants' hall, reviewing linens with a critical eye. "A fine old place, this manor," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational as she admired a folded tablecloth. "So many passages and doors. Easy to lose one's way." Mrs. Dodd, flattered by the attention, warmed to the topic. "Oh, aye, it's a maze to newcomers," she said. "That side door by the ballroom, it's meant for deliveries, but it's been trouble. The lock's been sticky for weeks, and with the gala, no one thought to fix it." Her words confirmed Mrs. Winthrop's account, but Miss Marple noted a hint of hesitation, as if Mrs. Dodd felt the lapse reflected poorly on her staff. Pressing gently, Miss Marple asked about the gala's preparations. Mrs. Dodd described the flurry of activity: footmen arranging tables, maids polishing silver, and Mrs. Winthrop overseeing every detail. "She was particular about that display table," Mrs. Dodd said, her voice tinged with admiration. "Wanted it just so, right by the curtains for effect." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. The table's placement, so close to the side door, seemed less a coincidence now. Had Mrs. Winthrop, in her meticulous planning, chosen it deliberately, knowing the door's fault? Or was it simply an aesthetic choice, as she claimed? In St. Mary Mead, a vicar's wife had once positioned a donation box near an open window, claiming innocence when coins vanished. But Miss Marple had seen through her, feigned surprise. Mrs. Dodd also mentioned the staff's movements during the gala. Young Thomas, the footman, was meant to check the doors, she said, her brow furrowing. But he was run off his feet, serving drinks and all. Miss Marple nodded, recalling Thomas's mention of Mr. Fairfax's request for sherry, which had drawn Emily away from the display. The manor's secrets, she thought, were not just in its passages, but in the choreography of its occupants, each movement a potential clue. She thanked Mrs. Dodd, her mind already mapping the path from the ballroom to the courtyard, a route that required only a moment's boldness. Later, in the library, Miss Marple sat by a crackling fire. Her knitting resumed as she pondered the manor's role in the theft. The side door's faulty lock was no accident, she suspected, but a deliberate oversight, exploited by someone with knowledge of the house. Mrs. Winthrop's authority made her a candidate, her strain hinting at a hidden motive. Fairfax's familiarity with the door, casually mentioned at luncheon, suggested he had noticed its potential. Voss's shop, so near the courtyard, pointed to his opportunity, while Emily's absence, however brief, had left the necklace unguarded. The manor, with its hidden passages and overlooked exits, was a silent accomplice, its secrets waiting to be pried loose. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to motive. The necklace's value was immense, but its theft required a plan, a hiding place, and a means of disposal. A jeweller like Voss could dismantle the gems, selling them discreetly. A gambler like Fairfax might see it as a ticket out of debt. Mrs. Winthrop, with her dwindling fortune, could benefit from an insurance claim, while Emily, though unlikely, might have acted out of desperation or manipulation. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had unravelled a theft by tracing a single footprint to a garden shed. Here, the courtyard gate was her footprint, a clue leading to the truth. Her needles clicked softly, each stitch a step closer to the heart of the manor's secrets, as she resolved to follow the path wherever it led. Chapter 8. A glint of deception. The soft glow of morning light spilled through the lace curtains of St. Mary's Manor's morning room, where Miss Jane Marple sat with Lady Beatrice Hartley, sharing a pot of tea, The room was a haven of calm, its walls adorned with delicate watercolour landscapes, a stark contrast to the turmoil that lingered from the theft of the Hartley ruby necklace. Miss Marple's knitting lay folded in her basket, her hands resting quietly in her lap as she listened to Lady Beatrice, whose pale face and trembling fingers betrayed the depth of her distress. The necklace, she had said, was more than a jewel. It was a tether to her late husband, a relic of love now lost to a thief's audacity. Miss Marple, with her gentle demeanour and piercing gaze, saw in Lady Beatrice's grief an opportunity to probe deeper, sensing that the necklace's history might illuminate the motives behind its disappearance. Lady Beatrice, a woman of refined beauty despite her years, sipped her tea with a fragility that belied her usual composure. Her grey silk dress, elegant yet subdued, seemed to mirror her mood, and her eyes, rimmed with fatigue, fixed on a distant point beyond the window. "It was Edward's last gift," she said, her voice low as if speaking to herself. "He chose the rubies himself, said they matched the fire in my heart." A faint smile touched her lips, then faded. "I lent it for the auction because Clara, Mrs. Winthrop, believed it would draw a generous bid for the orphanage. I never imagined." Her voice broke, and she pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Miss Marple murmured sympathy, her tone soothing, but her mind was alert, cataloguing every word. "You were most generous to offer it," Miss Marple said, her voice soft as a whisper. "It must have been a wrench to part with such a treasure, even for a night." Lady Beatrice nodded, her fingers twisting the handkerchief. "I hesitated," she admitted, "but Clara was so insistent, and the cause was worthy. I trusted her to keep it safe." The words carried a faint edge, and Miss Marple noted it, recalling Mrs. Winthrop's strained composure, and her insistence on checking the necklace herself. In St. Mary Mead, a vicar's wife had once trusted a friend with a cherished heirloom, only to find it pawned to cover a debt. Could Mrs. Winthrop's role as organizer conceal a similar betrayal? Miss Marple steered the conversation to the gala, her questions light, but deliberate. "I understand Mr. Voss appraised the necklace," she said, watching Lady Beatrice closely. "He must have been quite taken with it." Lady Beatrice's expression tightened, a shadow crossing her face. "He was very professional," she said, her tone careful. "But he did suggest resetting the rubies, said the gold was outdated. I refused, of course. It was perfect as it was." Her voice held a note of indignation, and Miss Marple's interest sharpened. A jeweller's suggestion to alter a piece could be innocent, but she recalled a saint. Mary Mead craftsman who had proposed repairs to a silver tray, only to substitute it with a forgery. Voss's expertise, she thought, made him capable of crafting a replica, perhaps to replace the original while pocketing the true gems. The conversation turned to the other suspects, and Lady Beatrice's insights were revealing. She spoke warmly of Emily Tate, calling her a sweet, if nervous girl. "She was so eager to help," Lady Beatrice said. "I saw her near the display, watching it like a hawk until Mr. Fairfax called her away." Her mention of Fairfax was less kind, her lips pursing. "He's charming, but too bold." Kept me talking about his travels while I was trying to watch the necklace. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts circling back to Fairfax's convenient distraction of Emily, which had left the display unguarded. Lady Beatrice's account confirmed the timeline, but it also hinted at a deeper connection between the necklace and its admirers. Had Voss's suggestion to reset the gems been a pretext to handle them closely? Or was Fairfax's chatter a calculated move to divert attention? As they finished their tea, Miss Marple rose, thanking Lady Beatrice with her usual courtesy. "You've been most kind to share your thoughts," she said, her eyes warm but keen. "I'm sure the necklace will be found." Lady Beatrice managed a weak smile, but her gaze lingered on the empty space where the necklace might have been. Miss Marple left the morning room, her mind turning over the new threads of information. The necklace's sentimental value, she realized, added a layer to the theft. Someone might have coveted it not just for its worth, but for what it represented. In St. Mary Mead, a stolen locket had been taken not for profit, but to wound its owner. Could a similar motive lurk here, or was greed the simpler answer? Walking through the manor's corridors, Miss Marple paused by the ballroom, where the display table now stood bare, a silent accusation. The side door, still ajar, drew her eye, and she recalled the courtyard's proximity to Voss's shop. His suggestion to reset the rubies was a glint of deception, she thought, a possible prelude to a switch. A jeweller of his skill could craft a replica, passing it off as the original while spiriting the true gems away. She pictured him at the gala, his nervous tics betraying a plan, perhaps slipping the necklace through the side door to a waiting hiding place. Yet she cautioned herself. Fairfax's role as a distractor and Mrs. Winthrop's oversight of the door's lock could not be ignored. Even Emily's absence, however innocent, had played its part. Miss Marple returned to the library, settling by the fire with her knitting, the soft click of her needles a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. Lady Beatrice's revelation about Voss's offer was a clue, one that pointed to his intimate knowledge of the necklace and his opportunity to tamper with it. In St. Mary Mead, a forger's pride had led to his downfall, his boasts revealing his guilt. Voss's professionalism, she suspected, masked a similar hubris, his nervous gestures a crack in his facade. The manor's secrets were unravelling, each conversation a thread pulled loose, and Miss Marple felt the pattern of the theft taking shape, its truth glimmering just out of reach. Chapter 9. The volunteer's confession. The soft hum of activity in St. Mary's Manor had settled into a subdued rhythm by mid-afternoon, the grand rooms now echoing with the quiet footsteps of staff and the occasional murmur of lingering guests. Miss Jane Marple sat in the conservatory, a glass-walled sanctuary filled with the lush green of ferns and the delicate scent of blooming orchids. Her knitting, needles moved with their usual precision, the pale pink shawl a growing testament to her patience. But her eyes were fixed on Miss Emily Tate, who stood near a potted palm, nervously arranging a tray of tea things. The young volunteer's face was pale, her dark curls slightly dishevelled, and her hands betrayed a tremor that Miss Marple found both pitiable and telling. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen such signs in a young girl who, overwhelmed by guilt, had confessed to a minor theft. Emily's distress, she sensed, held a key to the Hartley ruby necklace's disappearance. Emily's role at the gala had placed her at the heart of the theft's timeline, her brief absence from the display table creating the critical window for the crime. Her tearful admission to Miss Marple in the rose garden had been heartfelt, but incomplete. and Miss Marple knew that the truth often emerged in layers, like petals peeled from a tightly closed bud. She rose from her wicker chair, her shawl draped over her shoulders, and approached Emily with a gentle smile. "My dear, you look quite worn out," she said, her voice soft as a lullaby. "Would you sit with me a moment? These old bones could use a rest." Emily hesitated, then nodded, her eyes darting to the tray as if it were a lifeline. They settled on a bench near a bubbling fountain, its soft gurgle a soothing counterpoint to the tension in Emily's posture. Miss Marple's needles resumed their quiet rhythm, a sound that seemed to calm the girl, whose fingers twisted a napkin into knots. "It's a heavy thing to feel responsible," Miss Marple said, her tone inviting confidence. "You did so much for the gala, and yet you blame yourself for that moment you stepped away." Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I should have stayed by the table," she said. "Mrs. Winthrop trusted me, and I failed her." Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch light but reassuring. "Tell me exactly what happened, my dear," she said. "Every little detail helps, you know. Sometimes the smallest thing can make all the difference." Her words were gentle, but her gaze was keen, watching for the flicker of truth beneath Emily's distress. In St. Mary Mead, a young seamstress had once revealed a theft by recounting a seemingly trivial moment, and Miss Marple hoped Emily's story might yield a similar clue. Emily took a shaky breath, her eyes fixed on the fountain. "I was by the display table most of the evening," she began. "Mrs. Winthrop told me to keep an eye on it, said it was the most important job. I was proud, you know, to be trusted with something so valuable." Her voice held a note of pride, quickly overshadowed by guilt. "But just after 8, Mr. Fairfax came over. He was so friendly, smiling, asking about my work with the orphanage. Then he said he was parched, and asked if I could fetch him a glass of sherry from the refreshment table." She paused, her cheeks flushing. "I didn't want to be rude, and it was only across the room, so I went. I thought I'd be back in a moment." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. "And when you returned?" she prompted. Emily's hands clenched the napkin tighter. "The necklace was still there, or I thought it was. The case was closed, and I didn't look inside. It wasn't until Lady Beatrice screamed that I realized." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in the napkin, her shoulders shaking. Miss Marple's expression softened, but her mind was racing. Emily's absence, however brief, had been orchestrated, she suspected, by Fairfax's calculated charm. In her village, a similar distraction had allowed a thief to slip a silver spoon from a tea tray, the culprit relying on a young girl's eagerness to please. "How long were you gone, do you think?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as gentle as a breeze. Emily lifted her head, her eyes red-rimmed. "Not more than a minute or two," she said. "The refreshment table was busy, and I had to wait for the footman to pour the sherry. I kept looking back at the display, but I couldn't see it clearly through the crowd." Her words confirmed the timeline. Between 8 and 8:15, the necklace had vanished, and Emily's absence had left the table vulnerable. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Fairfax, whose request had been too convenient, and to the side door so near the display, which could have allowed a swift exit. "Did you notice anyone near the table when you returned?" Miss Marple asked, her voice light but probing. Emily frowned, her brow furrowing as she tried to recall. "There were so many people," she said, "but I think Mr." Voss was there, adjusting the light on the case. He was always fussing with it, like he was afraid it would be damaged. Her observation was casual, but Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Voss's presence at the critical moment, his nervous tics, and the ruby fragment in his shop formed a pattern, one that suggested more than professional diligence. She recalled a St. Mary Mead jeweller who had lingered over a stolen ring, his fussiness a cover for his theft. Miss Marple probed further, asking about Mrs. Winthrop and the gala's preparations. Emily spoke with admiration, describing her employer's meticulous planning. "She was everywhere that day," Emily said, "checking the table, the lights, even the door locks. She told me to stay by the necklace, said it was my responsibility." Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the weight of that responsibility, so heavy for a young girl. Mrs. Winthrop's insistence on the table security, yet her failure to ensure the side door's lock, was a contradiction that lingered in Miss Marple's mind. Could the organizer have deliberately left a gap? Or was Emily's role as a scapegoat part of a larger plan? As they spoke, Emily's confession grew more revealing. "I felt so out of place," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "All those fine people, and me in my plain dress. The necklace, it was like something from a dream. I kept thinking how lucky Lady Beatrice was to own such a thing." Her words held a trace of envy, and Miss Marple's needles paused. Envy, she knew, could drive impulsive acts, but Emily's openness suggested innocence rather than guile. In St. Mary Mead, a young maid had confessed to touching a stolen brooch, not to steal it, but to feel its beauty. Emily's admiration for the necklace, while genuine, did not seem to extend to theft, but her distraction had served someone else's purpose. Miss Marple thanked Emily, her smile warm, but her mind alert. "You've been most helpful, my dear," she said. "Don't blame yourself too much. People can be very clever in their ways." Emily managed a weak smile, her relief palpable, and returned to her tray. Miss Marple remained by the fountain, her thoughts weaving a tighter pattern. Emily's confession had clarified the timeline. Fairfax's request had drawn her away. Voss had been near the table, and the side door had offered an escape. Mrs. Winthrop's oversight, whether intentional or not, had facilitated the theft. The volunteer's zeal had been exploited, Miss Marple concluded, making her a pawn in a game she did not understand. Returning to the library, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resuming as the Manor's quiet settled around her. Emily's story was a thread, but not the whole cloth. Fairfax's charm, Voss's expertise, and Mrs. Winthrop's strain were still tangled, each pointing to a motive yet to be fully unravelled. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that the truth often hid in the smallest confessions, the moments when a heart spoke unguarded. Emily's tears were real, but they masked a larger deception, one that Miss Marple felt drawing closer with each click of her needles, as the Manor's secrets whispered their challenge. Chapter 10. The Jeweller's Slip. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Daintier's quiet streets, as Miss Jane Marple made her way to Mr. Leonard Voss's jewellery shop, her umbrella tapping a steady rhythm against the pavement. The air was sharp with the promise of autumn, and her shawl was drawn tightly about her shoulders, a shield against the chill and the weight of the mystery that consumed her thoughts. The theft of the Hartley ruby necklace had woven a complex web, and missed her. Voss, with his nervous tics and intimate knowledge of the gems, was a thread she could not ignore. Her visit to his shop 2 days prior had left her with a lingering suspicion. A ruby fragment on his workbench, its hue too close to the stolen necklace to be coincidence. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had once unmasked a forger by noting a single misplaced tool. Today she hoped for a similar revelation. The shop, nestled between a haberdashery and a tea-room, was a narrow sliver of elegance, its window displaying a modest array of brooches and rings on black velvet. A small bell tinkled as Miss Marple entered, her eyes adjusting to the dim light that glinted off polished glass cases. Mr. Voss stood behind the counter, his thin frame stooped over a loop, examining a gem with the intensity of a scholar deciphering a rare manuscript. His wire-rimmed spectacles slipped down his nose, and he pushed them up with a trembling finger, a gesture Miss Marple had come to recognize as a sign of unease. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice polite but strained, "how pleasant to see you again." Still seeking that brooch? His smile was tight, and she noted the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow. "Oh, indeed," she replied, her tone light as a feather. "Something simple, but I do so admire your craftsmanship." She moved to a display case, her eyes ostensibly on a pearl pin but scanning the workbench behind him. The ruby fragment was gone, replaced by a scattering of tools and a single emerald chip, but the memory of its crimson glow lingered in her mind. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Jeweller's apprentice, who had betrayed his guilt by hastily tidying his workspace when questioned. Voss's workbench, though orderly, seemed too pristine, as if evidence had been cleared away. "You must be so busy," she said, her voice warm but probing. "Especially after appraising such a treasure as the Hartley necklace." Voss's hand faltered, the loop nearly slipping from his grasp. "A tragedy, its loss," he said, his voice low and clipped. "I certified its authenticity that morning. Flawless rubies, unmatched in clarity." He polished his glasses with a handkerchief, a nervous habit that Miss Marple noted with growing certainty. "It must be distressing," she said, her eyes soft but unyielding, "to have handled such a piece only for it to vanish. I suppose one might be tempted to recreate its beauty. With your skill, her words were innocent, but their edge was deliberate, and Voss's reaction was immediate. A sharp glance, his lips parting as if to protest, then closing tightly. "Recreate it," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I would never. My reputation rests on honesty." His denial was swift, but his eyes darted to the workbench, a fleeting betrayal that Miss Marple caught. She recalled a village craftsman who had protested his innocence with similar vehemence, only to be found with stolen silver in his shed. Voss's expertise, she thought, was both his strength and his vulnerability, allowing him to craft a replica that could fool all but the most discerning eye. She leaned closer to the display case, her fingers brushing a sapphire ring. "Of course," she said, her tone soothing. "But it's remarkable, isn't it? How a skilled hand could mimic such a piece. I once knew a man in St. Mary Mead who made a false locket, and no one noticed until the clasp broke. Voss's face paled, and he busied himself with rearranging a tray of earrings, his hands trembling. "A locket is simple," he muttered. "The Hartley necklace was complex. gold filigree, precise settings, not easily copied. His words were meant to deflect, but they revealed too much, and Miss Marple's needles, had they been in her hands, would have paused. His knowledge of the necklace's intricacies, while expected of a jeweller, suggested a deeper familiarity, perhaps from hours spent crafting a substitute. She recalled Lady Beatrice's mention of Voss's offer to reset the rubies, a suggestion that now seemed less about aesthetics and more about opportunity. Changing tack, Miss Marple asked about the gala, her voice as casual as if discussing the weather. "You are near the display table often, I hear," she said, ensuring it was shown to its best, no doubt. Voss nodded, his fingers tightening on the handkerchief. "Mrs. Winthrop asked me to check the lighting," he said. "The rubies needed to shine for the auction." His alibi, tied to the squire's vague recollection, was shaky, and Miss Marple noted his reluctance to elaborate. "It must have been a busy evening," she said. "So many people, and that side door so close. Easy for someone to slip out unnoticed." Voss's eyes widened briefly, and he coughed, a thin sound that betrayed his nerves. "I didn't notice the door," he said too quickly. "I was focused on the necklace." Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of mild interest, but her mind was racing. The side door, leading to the courtyard and mere steps from Voss's shop, was a critical link. His denial, coupled with his nervous gestures, suggested he knew more than he admitted. She recalled the ruby fragment, its presence now conspicuously absent, and pictured Voss slipping the necklace through the door, perhaps hiding it in his shop until the furor died down. In St. Mary Mead, a thief had been caught when a single bead from a stolen bracelet was found in his garden. The fragment in Voss's shop was her bead, a clue that pointed to his guilt, though not yet proof. As she left the shop, thanking Voss with her usual courtesy, Miss Marple paused on the street, her umbrella tapping thoughtfully. Voss's slip, his defensive reaction to her mention of a replica, had confirmed her suspicions. His expertise made him the most likely to have crafted a fake, swapping it for the original during the gala's chaos. The side door's proximity to his shop offered a perfect escape, and his nervous tics betrayed a conscience under strain. Yet, she cautioned herself, the puzzle was not complete. Fairfax's distraction of Emily, Mrs. Winthrop's oversight of the door, and Emily's absence were threads that still needed weaving. Voss was a central figure, but was he the mastermind, or a tool in a larger scheme? Returning to the manor, Miss Marple settled in the library, her knitting resuming as the fire crackled. The jeweller's slip was a crack in the facade, a glimpse of deception that pointed to his role in the theft. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that the guilty often betrayed themselves in small ways. A glance, a pause, a too quick denial. Voss's nerves, his knowledge, and the missing ruby fragment were pieces of a pattern, one that Miss Marple felt drawing tighter with each passing hour. Her needles clicked on, each stitch a step closer to the truth, as the manor's secrets whispered their final challenge. Chapter 11. The Trap. The twilight cast a soft veil over St. Mary's Manor, its turrets silhouetted against a sky streaked with the last hues of sunset. Inside, the library's fire cast flickering shadows on the walls, where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles idle in her lap, a rare pause in their ceaseless rhythm. The theft of the Hartley ruby necklace had woven a complex tapestry, and Mr. Leonard Voss, with his nervous tics, ruby fragment and intimate knowledge of the gems, stood at its centre. Yet Miss Marple, with her St. Mary Mead wisdom, knew that suspicion alone was not enough. Proof required a careful nudge, a trap to coax the truth from its hiding place. Her sharp eyes, bright beneath her unassuming exterior, gleamed with the quiet resolve of one who had unravelled many a village secret by letting the guilty betray themselves. The pieces of the puzzle were aligning. Emily Tate's distraction by Mr. Fairfax, Mrs. Winthrop's oversight of the unlocked side door, and Voss's opportunity to slip through it. His shop a mere whisper away from the manor's courtyard. The ruby fragment in his shop, now conspicuously absent, had been a beacon, pointing to a possible replica crafted to deceive. Miss Marple recalled a saint, Mary Mead Forger, who had panicked when a rumour of discovery spread, rushing to hide his work and revealing his guilt. A similar tactic, she decided, might unsettle Voss, whose nervous demeanour suggested a man teetering on the edge of confession. With the constable, Mr. Harrow, she devised a subtle plan, one that relied on the power of suggestion rather than confrontation. Over a discreet tea in the manor's morning room, Miss Marple shared her thoughts with Mr. Harrow, her voice as gentle as if discussing the weather. "It occurs to me, Mr. Harrow," she said, her eyes on her teacup, "that a thief might be tempted to check their hiding place if they thought it at risk. A rumour, perhaps, of a ruby found in the courtyard, nothing official, mind you, might stir someone to act." Mr. Harrow, a man of method but limited imagination, rubbed his chin, his brow furrowing. "A trap, you mean?" he said, his tone sceptical but intrigued. "Could work, I suppose, if we keep it quiet." Miss Marple nodded, her smile mild. "People talk, you know," she said. "A word to a maid, a whisper among the staff. It travels." In St. Mary Mead, she had once flushed out a thief by letting a rumour of a lost ring spread through the village shop. The plan was set in motion with delicate precision. Miss Marple spoke casually to Mrs. Dodd, the housekeeper, mentioning a gardener's claim of spotting a red glint near the courtyard gate. "Probably nothing," she said, her tone dismissive, "but one wonders." Mrs. Dodd, ever eager for gossip, shared the tidbit with a footman, who passed it to a maid, and soon the manor buzzed with whispers of a possible clue. Miss Marple, returning to the library, resumed her knitting. Her ears attuned to the subtle shifts in the house's atmosphere. She knew Voss, with his shop so near the courtyard, would hear the rumour, and his reaction would speak louder than words. That evening, as the manor settled into a quiet hush, Miss Marple positioned herself in a shadowed alcove near the ballroom, a vantage point overlooking the side door. Mr. Harrow, reluctantly persuaded, waited nearby, concealed behind a heavy curtain, his notebook ready, but his patience thin. The courtyard beyond was dark, its yew hedges a perfect screen for clandestine movements. Miss Marple's heart beat a little faster, not from fear, but from the thrill of anticipation, a feeling she knew well from her village days, when a mystery neared its resolution. In St. Mary Mead, a poacher had been caught checking a trap after a rumour of a gamekeeper's patrol, and she hoped Voss would prove as predictable. At 9:30, a faint creak broke the silence, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A figure emerged from the side door, moving with cautious haste. It was Voss, his thin frame unmistakable, even in the dim light, his spectacles glinting as he glanced about. He carried a small lantern, its beam low and focused, and his steps were quick as he crossed the courtyard to the gate. Miss Marple's breath caught, her suspicions confirmed. Voss knelt by a yew hedge, his hands fumbling in the soil, muttering to himself. "The replacement? It's safe. It must be," she heard, his voice a strained whisper. The words were a confession, and Miss Marple's needles, had they been in her hands, would have stilled. Mr. Harrow stepped forward, his heavy tread deliberate, and Voss froze, his lantern dropping with a soft clatter. "Mr. Voss," the constable said, his voice firm, "what brings you here at this hour?" Voss's face, caught in the moonlight, was a mask of panic, his spectacles slipping as he stammered. I thought I dropped something, a tool from the gala." His excuse was feeble, and Miss Marple emerged from the alcove, her presence as unassuming as ever. "A ruby, perhaps," she said, her tone gentle but piercing. Voss's eyes widened, and he sagged, his resistance crumbling like dry leaves. The confession came in a rush, as if a dam had broken. "I couldn't help it," Voss said, his voice breaking. "The shop, debts piling up, creditors at my door." "The necklace was my salvation." He admitted to crafting a replica using paste gems and gold plate, swapping it for the original during the gala, while Emily was distracted by Fairfax's request. "I adjusted the light," he said, his hands shaking, "and made the switch. Slipped it through the side door to my shop before anyone noticed." The true necklace, he confessed, was hidden in a false compartment in his safe, its rubies intact but ready to be sold discreetly. Miss Marple listened, her expression one of quiet sympathy, but her mind was cataloguing the details, each one fitting neatly into the pattern she had woven. Mr. Harrow took Voss into custody, his notebook filled with the jeweller's words, and Miss Marple returned to the library. Her knitting resumed as the manor stirred with the news. Voss's slip in the courtyard, prompted by a simple rumour, had unravelled his deception, just as she had hoped. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that the guilty often tripped over their own fears, and Voss's panic had been his undoing. Fairfax's distraction, Mrs. Winthrop's unlocked door, and Emily's absence had all played their parts. But Voss, with his skill and desperation, had been the architect of the theft. The manor's secrets, once so tangled, were now laid bare, and Miss Marple's needles clicked on, each stitch a quiet triumph as she awaited the final resolution. Chapter 12. The Resolution. The morning sun cast a golden glow through the tall windows of St. Mary's Manor, bathing the drawing-room in a warmth that seemed to soften the edges of the tension that had gripped the house for days. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair near a rosewood table, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, the pale pink shawl now nearly complete. The theft of the Hartley ruby necklace, which had cast a shadow over the charity gala, was resolved, and the manor buzzed with a mixture of relief and subdued chatter. Mr. Leonard Voss's confession, prompted by Miss Marple's carefully laid trap, had unravelled the mystery, and the necklace was recovered, its crimson gems gleaming once more in their rightful place. Yet, as Miss Marple sipped her tea, her sharp eyes observed the final threads of the drama, knowing that every mystery left echoes to be addressed. The necklace had been found exactly where Voss had confessed, in a false compartment in his shop safe, wrapped in velvet and untouched, its rubies as vivid as the night they vanished. Constable Harrow, with a mixture of pride and bemusement, had overseen its retrieval. his notebook now filled with the jeweller's detailed account. Voss, driven by mounting debts and the threat of losing his shop, had crafted a replica using paste gems and gold plate, a work so skillful it had fooled all but the most discerning eye. During the gala, while Emily Tate was distracted by Mr. Fairfax's request for sherry, Voss had adjusted the display's lighting, swapped the necklaces, and slipped the original through the side door to his shop, mere steps from the Manor's courtyard. His plan had been to dismantle the rubies later, selling them discreetly to settle his debts. But Miss Marple's rumour of a ruby in the courtyard had flushed him out, his panic leading to his downfall. Mrs. Clara Winthrop, the gala's organiser, stood near the drawing-room's fireplace, her emerald gown replaced by a sombre grey dress that reflected her chastened mood. The unlocked side door, which she had attributed to a footman's oversight, had been a critical lapse, and her relief at the necklace's recovery was tempered by embarrassment. "I should have been more vigilant," she said to Miss Marple, her voice low as she poured tea. "To think it was so close, all this time," Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle understanding, but her thoughts lingered on Mrs. Winthrop's strain during the gala. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a woman whose meticulous nature hid a fear of failure, and Mrs. Winthrop's oversight, while not criminal, suggested a burden of pride that had blinded her to the door's vulnerability. Her reputation, however, would recover, bolstered by the orphanage's successful fundraising, despite the scandal. Mr. Gerald Fairfax, lounging in a corner with his usual charm, had escaped formal suspicion, but Miss Marple's keen gaze noted his subdued demeanour. His request for sherry, which had drawn Emily away from the display, had been a calculated distraction, though he denied any collusion with Voss. "Pure coincidence," he said with a shrug, his smile less convincing than before. Miss Marple, recalling a saint. Mary Mead gambler whose charm masked opportunism, suspected Fairfax had sensed an opportunity to aid Voss, perhaps for a share of the profits or to settle a debt. His shaky alibi and casual mention of the side door had marked him as a player in the drama, but without proof, he remained untarnished. His charm a shield that Miss Marple knew would not hold forever. Miss Emily Tate, the young volunteer, was a picture of relief, her earnest face no longer shadowed by guilt. She hovered near the tea tray, her hands steady as she offered biscuits to guests. Miss Marple had spoken with her earlier, assuring her that her brief absence had been exploited, not her fault. "You were trying to help, my dear," Miss Marple had said, her tone as warm as a hearth fire. Emily's tears had dried, her confidence slowly returning, and Miss Marple saw in her the resilience of youth. In her village, a young maid had once been cleared of theft when the true culprit was caught. And Emily's innocence, like that maid's, was a small victory in the larger resolution. Lady Beatrice Hartley, radiant despite her ordeal, had invited Miss Marple to a private tea in gratitude. The necklace, returned to her, lay in its velvet case on a side table, its rubies catching the light like captured flames. "I cannot thank you enough, Miss Marple," she said, her voice rich with emotion. "You've given me back a piece of Edward." Her gratitude was genuine, and Miss Marple smiled, her needles pausing. "It's merely observation, Lady Beatrice," she said, her tone modest. "People are much the same, whether in a grand manor or my little village." She declined to elaborate, her saint. Mary Mead wisdom a quiet force that needed no fanfare. Lady Beatrice's relief was tempered by a vow to never lend the necklace again, a decision Miss Marple privately approved. Constable Harrow, bustling with newfound purpose, had taken Voss into custody, the jeweller's confession ensuring a swift case. As Miss Marple prepared to leave the manor, her knitting tucked into her basket, Mr. Harrow approached, his hat in hand. "You've a knack for this, ma'am," he said, a grudging respect in his voice. "That rumour was a clever trick." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Just a thought, Mr. Harrow," she said. "The guilty often trip over their own fears." She offered no more, her role in the trap a secret she left to the manor's whispers. As she stepped into the waiting carriage, the manor's turrets fading into the morning mist, Miss Marple reflected on the puzzle now solved. Voss's desperation, Fairfax's opportunism, Mrs. Winthrop's oversight, and Emily's innocence had formed a pattern, one she had unravelled with the same quiet patience she applied to her knitting. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that human nature was a constant, its frailties as predictable in a grand house as in a village cottage. The necklace's recovery was a triumph, but the true reward, she knew, was the clarity of truth, its threads neatly woven into a tapestry of understanding. Her needles, silent now, awaited the next mystery, as the carriage rolled toward home, leaving the manor's secrets behind.